Welcome to this special meeting of the Nacogdoches Independent School District Board of Trustees. Let the record reveal that a quorum of the board is present and that notice of this meeting has been legally posted in accordance with the Texas Open Meeting Act. Please remember that items do not have to be taken in the order shown on the agenda, and join us in switching your phones to a silent mode. The board will now call agenda item 2A, consideration of the board action on revisions to the board operating procedures. Ms. Kelly has made edits to the operating procedures as requested by the board in our previous two workshops. Those edits now appear in blue, and tonight is our opportunity to ask questions of Kelly, and if we ever get the bugs out, Mr. Craybill, before approving the documents as established operating procedures for the Nacogdoches Independent School District Board of Trustees. During this portion of the meeting,
8874 does not work. We'll just call him.
Call him.
Okay, we're gonna call him.
Okay.
you want to wait to get him on the phone?
Two 8362. There you go.
Good evening.
Good evening, Mr. AJ.
Okay, we're opening up now. AJ?
I'm sorry, our technology is not quite working out.
Yeah.
Does this need to go to there?
Probably so.
Okay, during this portion of the meeting, there will be no opportunity for community involvement. As the board works through the final edits of our operating procedures, with Mr. Craybill, we ask the audience to be respectful and refrain from speaking or disrupting. We will now call on Kelly.
Good evening, Reverend Irvin, board members, Ms. Dowdy. You should have in front of you a duplicate of what was emailed as the most recent version of the board operating procedures. What I did in essence was accept all the track changes that had been provided in previous documents, and to the best of my ability, incorporated what I understood your intentions to be based upon your remarks in the last two workshops as you reviewed each section and the track changes that were presented to you. I will, commit to you that at times I struggled to read my own handwriting, and so there is no intended motive here behind any of this content, but rather just my best effort to relay what I had thought I understood your intentions to be. So as we go through each one, or as you pose your questions, keep that in mind and provide a little bit of grace. I have flagged a couple of sections where I have some information where there were blanks, and so at a minimum I want to go through that and fill that information in for you, but otherwise I'm assuming that you all have read the blue and are prepared to shoot either myself or Mr. Craybill your questions. He also has a copy of this document. Mr. Irvin.
Okay, just a minute. AJ,
Yes, sir.
can you hear Kelly pretty good?
I can hear okay, but not great. The one thing I didn't hear clearly is I think she was describing when this evening that there would be community engagement, but I didn't understand that. It was too light for me to hear.
Okay,
What did he say?
he couldn't hear you good.
Mr. Crabell, this is Kelly. Can you hear better now?
Yes,
Much?
thank you.
Okay, good. I was just going through the procedures that have occurred since our last workshop as far as presenting this revised document to the board members. I did not reference community input. I think Reverend Irvin did in his opening remarks. Once we get to the Lone Star governance portion of the meeting, I think that's when Reverend Irvin will provide a format for public participation and input into the constraint process. But on the operating procedures, we're at the end of the stretch here on the board operating procedures, and so we just need to get any feedback at all from the board members on what we have in front of them, get it adopted, and then move on to the substance of tonight's meeting.
Perfect. Thank you for that clarification.
Okay, guys, any questions? Did everybody have a chance to?
I just had a question on page 8. Well, it'd be more like page 9, well, page 8D. When addressing the board of trustees, persons shall stand at the podium and face the board. Participants will conduct themselves with a common courtesy and respect for the board members. The audience shall refrain from talking or applauding during the public comment portion of the meeting. I understand that they should not talk, but I'm not sure about the applauding. What's with that? I mean, I just,
That's completely up to the board members as far as intended to deal with your ability to hear, to ensure that you can hear the speaker so that if there's any Q&A between the person at the podium and one or more board members, the administration's trying to respond, things of that nature.
I'm looking at page 15 and 16. Is that a new addition to, and is it necessary with adults?
Yes, that is a new section. That is, as I indicated in my email to you, that the section they're referring to, Mr. Craybill, is the enforcement mechanism as far as how will you enforce a violation of the operating procedures. And so I wish I could recall off the top of my head who I stole this from, but when I read it, I thought, boy, this is entirely consistent with what we commonly hear TASB lawyers providing as far as guidance to board members on, you know, how do you handle something when you feel like maybe one board member has strayed and violated an operating procedure, because it's certainly not the superintendent's role to police the board. And so how do you as board members, you know, raise a concern? And so what you have outlined here is, again, just a suggestion from another district's board operating procedures, but also consistent with what you'll hear at your TASB conferences, is that as you mentioned, you're adults, so you first approach it with common courtesy, and if you have the individual concern, I believe the procedure is outlined such that you approach that individual trustee first, you talk about it, try to work it out. If that doesn't work, then maybe you involve the board president. If that doesn't work, then maybe we put it on the agenda and we talk about it as a board, because you can go into closed session under 074 to evaluate officers and trustees, just as you do deliberate duties and responsibilities of your employees. And then the worst case scenario would be possibly, if that dialogue didn't prove productive, was that maybe the board could even publicly reprimand or chastise under a properly posted agenda. And so that section just walks you through that process, kind of a graduated process of discipline, so to speak, on how you would address from a minor to a more major infraction of your board operating procedures. So I wanted to give you that as an option to consider, because I found it late in the ballgame. Mr. Craybill, do you have any comments on that? Pros or cons?
No, I think the question that's raised is an appropriate question. I think what the board needs to decide is, does the board feel that it's particularly important for its policies to be followed? If the board feels strongly about that, then the board needs a mechanism for making sure that they're followed. If the board doesn't feel strongly about whether or not the policies are followed, then they actually don't need a mechanism for ensuring that they're followed. And so it's really kind of up to the board. Some boards, want things written down, but they don't want a mechanism. Other boards do. But I think the key decision that the board has to make is, is it important to you that your policies are followed? If so, then you need something that speaks to that. If that's not a major concern for the board, then you don't need something for that.
Mr. Craybill, I totally understand what you say. However, we have a school board members' code of ethics, and I believe we all are adult. And adding that chapter to those pages somehow gives an indication that there is no so-called communication or somebody violating at the same time, gives a cause, being basically, to be honest, plainly said, nitpicking on each other.
I completely hear you. The same reason that your policies outline, your policies for superintendent behavior come with understanding of what happens if the policies are not followed. Your policies for staff behavior come with an understanding of what happens if the policies are not followed. And so the policies for board behavior, it's the board's decision whether or not those come with expectations for if they're not followed. And again, that's, it's just a board decision. Some boards decide to have that, some boards don't.
Thank you.
I have a few things I went through, Kelly. Are you ready for me?
I think so.
All right.
Hit me.
Starting with page 7, item 1A on number 2, it says board members may request through the board president items they wish to have considered for placement on the agenda. I would like to add board president and/or superintendent. I believe that's the current procedures we can email.
What page is that on?
7.
Page 7, item 1A, line 2. Board members may request to the board president items they wish to have considered for placement on the agenda. I believe our current procedure is that we can notify the board president and/or superintendent because they're working together as a team to set that agenda. Would that be acceptable to everyone? Oh, okay. On item 3 in that same section, this is more of a cleanup, Kelly. This talks about the board president shall ensure that any topics the board or individual board members have requested to be addressed are either on that agenda or scheduled for deliberation on or before the next regularly scheduled meeting. That's just a little wordy. I would like to delete either on that agenda or, because that's just duplicative. Because we're saying members have requested to be addressed are scheduled for deliberation on or before the next regularly scheduled meeting. Follow me there?
So it should just read are scheduled for deliberation on or before.
Correct.
I got it?
We
I don't
just,
think
we,
it changes the meaning.
it does not
also.
change the meaning, it just cleans up the text.
Very good.
Let me flip forward here. Page 11, there was a section added, I believe that's section 11, or I guess that's 6 actually, I apologize. Section 6, anonymous phone calls and/or letters. It reads, the Nacogdoches Board of Trustees encourages constituent input. However, anonymous calls or letters will not receive board attention, discussion, or response and will not result in directives to the administration. That concerns me just a little bit because we could obtain, I have known, not necessarily in my service at the school board, but in prior experience where an anonymous letter was sent regarding illegal activity, and once investigated, that illegal activity proved out to be true, but the whistleblower in that scenario submitted the information anonymously. So I think we may be short-sighted by saying we will not look into something we receive anonymously because it may be legitimate. Can we discuss that a little bit? I don't necessarily, I think I know what the intent here was, but I'm afraid we may be chopping ourselves off at the knees in the process.
I think the concern is valid, and I think what you're trying to do is strike a balance between getting people comfortable with coming forward and knowing that they can do so in such a way that they will receive an appropriate administrative response, so that you're not coming to this administration or the superintendent with, you need to know this is going on, but I can't tell you who told me, because then she or he is unable to follow through and discern or investigate, and so you need to find a balance with your scenario, which I believe that I certainly in that situation would advise that we investigate and respond regardless of whether there was a signature attached, if there was illegal activity, with just the common, the practical intent of the language.
So is there a way to either reword this to strike that balance, or, can we address that?
I would suggest under A, you can consider saying, instead of will not receive, you can say maybe will not require. It means you can't act on it. And then in the next sentence, it says will not result in. You could say it may or may not result in. I mean, there's a way you could give this some flexibility. I don't think the intent was to just ignore, not pay any attention to anything that comes in.
I agree with you. I
And
don't
so-
think that's the intent. I just think
And
that
so
that's the way it comes
should be
off.
changed so that we can, because this does read a little bit such that you're not even gonna pay any attention to it, and that's really not the way that's supposed to go.
Mr. Craybill, I remember talking about anonymous complaints in the last workshop, that you had some thoughts on this, but I don't want to speak for you. Do you recall talking about this?
Every organization deals with these things differently. I've seen some boards deal with this through having an ombudsman of some sort, whose job it is, whether that's an internal or external person, an internal individual, or a third-party service that is, acquired. I've seen it handled that way, and then the ombudsman is left to sort out, whether or not things proceed. Every organization has to wrestle with how to address these. Even here at the agency, there are areas of statute where if there is something anonymous, we don't really have the authority to follow up or do anything, and so just nothing happens. But there are other areas of statute where, as an agency, we would accept, an anonymous complaint, and so it just varies, by circumstance. So the short answer is there's not an easy, obvious answer. It's something that the board's going to have to make a decision on. I will say that whatever decision the board makes, I'd strongly encourage the board to actually honor whatever decision it makes, whichever direction it chooses to go. I think the important part is just actually follow your operating procedures, whatever you choose for them to be.
I was just noting there is already an exception written in at the end, except as indicated by federal or state law, board policy, or advice of the district's legal counsel.
What about
But
changing?
that's just saying confidentiality is strictly maintained when
Okay.
possible.
I was
It's not
thinking about the
addressing-
same, I was thinking about the same kind of
Oh,
exception.
okay.
That maybe utilize that.
Could we just
somehow.
ask you to go back and work on tweaking that would allow us the flexibility to authorize an investigation when needed?
Yeah, maybe just the may or may not language instead.
I agree.
Of the adequately, instead of the will not, the may or may not, and then it's left up to the
Gives you the flexibility.
factual,
I would agree.
specific situation.
If there's a child abuse and somebody anonymously reported,
Exactly.
and something come in the future, it says, oh, I told you also. So how do you deal with that?
Absolutely.
Actually, those are supposed to be done anonymously.
I don't,
All right, so you can tweak that for us and get a revision back out to us for review prior
Yes.
to our consideration, correct?
You said they have to be done anonymously?
Well, I'm just saying that you can't let the people know who,
no, and then neighbor reported.
right, if somebody reported it, they can't report who reported it.
On page 12, section 9, Just a couple of cleanup items. You've got two A's there. It should be A, B, C, D. And then on A, the wording on that's just a little messy. I would like to just clean it up to say, the board shall prepare a written evaluation of the superintendent annually. If we choose to do more, we can, but the way it was written wasn't concise. Maybe that's the right word. Would you be in agreement with that one? The way it was
Just
written?
plain devil's advocate, that if you have a superintendent who gets a more frequent evaluation and is not satisfied with that valuation, I would hate for that language to come back.
You mean the more frequent intervals?
Yes.
I'm okay with that. I think it was the "at" that really threw me off on that.
Okay,
The superintendent at annual, I think it should, written evaluation of the superintendent annually. Or more frequent intervals as determined by, if needed, or as determined by the board. I don't know. I know we've got a requirement, a state requirement to do it at least annually. On page 13, section 13, role and authority of board members. I see where you have added each board member is required to sign a conflict of disclosure statement. In Lone Star Governance, what I recall reading in that is that we're actually supposed to provide that form in the document as well. I don't think it necessarily called a form, but a template.
in what document it was?
In the policy procedure manual.
I can check that. In the, not the board operating procedures, but the
Yeah, I'm sorry,
actual-
the
oh, okay.
operating procedures, they actually in this document.
Okay. Okay, that's an easy fix. I'll see if that's required.
I almost, let's see, missed this.
I think, don't you fill it out though online generally?
I
No,
didn't,
it's
I had
not-
hard
it's a
copy.
hard
Yeah,
copy
hard
that you
copy.
give
Hard
them?
copy.
Okay, all right.
Hold on, let's a second, I've got one more thing here, let me read. They shall be to fill the unexpired term, they shall. Okay, back up, almost missed this one, on section 12, filling a board member vacancy, the very last sentence, I would like to strike "or an at-large position." That's just a cleanup, because if we appoint from the district representative, it would
That
be the
an
district
at-large,
representative.
yeah.
Page 14, section 15, media inquiries to the board. This section changed quite a bit, and I'm a little uncomfortable with the proposal to strike out the sentence, individual board members can answer media questions related to their personal stance on pending issues. That being stricken, and it's basically saying that all board members who receive the media should direct them to the board president or designee. That, to me, says we're not allowed to speak our public opinion, and I personally have a problem with that. As an elected official, prior to a vote, if there's an item that is coming up for vote, I understand the concept of team of eight. After the vote, we're a team of eight, we all back the vote. Prior to that, though, if I have,
The intent behind this section, and keep that into consideration as we tweak it, is to craft language that clarifies who has the authority to speak on behalf of the board, and so that is clear that you have delegated that to your board president or to whomever. You know, some boards that are larger will have a media committee even that where there's somebody, and some delegated to the communications department and not even
Sure.
the board. So that's the intent of this section,
Okay.
is to decide
and I'm extremely
who
comfortable
speaks
with the.
on behalf of the district.
I'm extremely comfortable with that language if you include speaking on behalf of the board as a whole. But that's not the way it's currently written. So
That's
we would
page-
need to tweak that.
On page 12 on the old one, it simply said, individual board members can answer media questions related to their personal stance on a pending issues.
Correct. And in this copy, they're taking it out. And so, by way of this, it's saying, the way it's written right now, the proposal is all board members who receive calls from the media should direct them to the board president. So if any one of us expressed our personal opinion, we would be in violation of this board operating policy.
Tell me what your practice is typically, so I'll just craft it that way. So what,
I mean, I think, and I think from my perception, the practice is that the board president speaks on behalf of the board, but if a media representative were to contact me and ask me my personal opinion on an item,
How
I
about-
can speak to my personal
how
opinion.
about language that simply says, shall so indicate? In other words, if you're speaking to media or the community or whomever in your personal capacity, then you just simply need to indicate that you're not speaking on behalf of the board, whether it's to the media, or I guess this section it addresses only media, but sometimes you have, I'm at this meeting, this community get together, and I'm at that community get together.
Sure.
You're not speaking for the board, you're speaking as an individual.
And I'd be comfortable with
Okay,
that.
I'll play with
I
that.
know that I am personally very cautious to always make sure that people realize when I do speak, I am speaking from my personal opinion, not that of the board.
That's also my concern, because recently they're asking me, do you want a TEA takeover? Do you wanna go with the charter school, or what do you wanna do? I said I have to wait to see what the board is making decisions. So,
And then does
Sometimes-
everybody
sometimes-
understand the second part of that, which is once a decision is made?
we have, but I have personal opinion as well, but I like to express it sometimes, that this is my thought.
Any other dialogue about this?
Well, this is not speaking to me talking to individuals. This is talking about when you go to the media.
Or if the media comes to you.
Yeah. or
Yeah,
media
which is
comes
more
in.
likely.
That's what it's speaking to, as far as,
And a
Good
good,
question.
and a good journalist, if they were doing a story on a heated issue, they're going to want to reflect both sides. They're going to find somebody to speak on the pro and somebody on the con side so that they've got both perspectives. So, I feel like we need to allow that conversation to exist.
Is everybody okay, as long as I put the precursor in that, and if anyone speaks to the media other than the board president, you need to clarify that you're speaking in your personal capacity. It's your
Absolutely.
personal opinion, that you're not speaking on behalf of the board.
We certainly shouldn't be in potential violation of our own procedures if the media calls us and we answer a question. So,
I will clear that up.
I'm fine.
Thank you. I appreciate that, gentlemen. On page 15, at the very top, item C, it says, "The State Board of Education shall require a trustee to complete at least 3 hours." I don't think we can put in our policy what the State Board of Education shall require. So, I think we need to
That's a quote straight
reword
from the
that.
statute,
Yeah,
yeah.
I think we need to probably reword that, or then my second question on that is, if it is a State Board of
Right.
Education statute requirement, does
Why
it
is
really need to
our
be in
board
here?
operating procedures?
Yeah,
I got that.
does it really need to be repeated? Under section 17, I circled it makes a reference to reimbursable expenses. Board members shall be reimbursed for reasonable and allowable expenses as outlined in the NISD travel guidelines. I've never seen the NISD travel guidelines before. I don't know if you guys did. I did request a copy. I'm not sure if it was sent, did it get sent to everybody? I just felt like we needed to be sure to read those to know what we were agreeing to in our board
Yeah,
policies.
that's from your old language, so
Yeah.
I just.
Website?
Okay. Just to make sure that we're well educated as to what we're saying there. And that was it for me, Kelly.
Okay.
Thank y'all for listening.
I just had one comment on 15, as a board member,
Page 15, or no,
page 15, 18, compliance with board operating procedures. Just, as a board member, I certainly want to be in compliance, and I think this gives us structure and consistency in dealing with those situations. And so I just think it's a good procedure.
can tell you what's not addressed here that I did start seeing is social media. I'm starting to see sections in board operating procedures regarding trustee use of social media. So
Oh,
maybe
that's
we'll
a very
save
good
that for next
question.
year.
Yeah, that probably, that's very relevant.
But, the one thing I would say about that is that you do, of course, want to always be cognizant of the Open Meetings Act and not inadvertently through posting, dialogue, commenting, to be creating a meeting for your deliberation online. So, so I did see a few of those. And TASB actually has published an entire, publication on trustees and use of social media, so that might be something that you
Could
want
you
to
have that distributed to us? That'd be
Actually, I have it right in
interesting.
front of me, so yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. Let me just bring out a couple other things, and I don't recall specifically who, but I did get some feedback from trustees when I sent these out, and so I wanted to just go through that with you. There was on page 8, well, under public participation, there was a comment about whether or not we might want to include in our operating procedures where on the agenda public comment should fit, and that it might be productive in light of the last discussion had on public comment to always have it after recognitions as opposed to prior to recognitions.
I think I made that
In other
suggestion
words,
to you.
yeah, so that to allow the parents who are here and everyone who's being recognized to be able to, that we give that priority and do that first on the agenda and not make them sit through 30 minutes of public comment on things, but that's,
It simply allows the parents or audience to see what good things happening, decide what the
Absolutely.
negative. Then they can leave.
I did have one thing about that though, is in our information items, recently, we've had a lot of demonstrations with students where they brought students in. And the only thing I'm thinking about is,
When we're doing the showcases.
when we're doing showcases and some other stuff, the only concern I have is that we ought to always keep the kids. I understand adults may be a little inconvenienced, but having kids stay later is, I just think we need to be real careful that if we put a specific thing in and we've got kids that are in showcase and we're gonna put them off. And honestly, sometimes, not all the young kids need to hear everything that's in public comments.
And they get a little less.
But we're talking about 30 minutes of public comment. And if we can't adjust that schedule to put it where it needs to be, I don't want to see it at the end of because I think parents also have to get their kids to school the next day and stuff. I just think we have to be fair about this and make sure that we do the best we can to give that ability for people to be able to do that.
I think the intent is that if we have, like I said, a showcase way down the schedule, and we have a large group of kids out there waiting, if we could bring them up, let them make their presentation so they can move forward with other activities and prepare for the next day. I agree with you, James.
Well, that's exactly what we proposed. It said, let introduce, recognize the individual groups and the students, then when they leave, then the,
Well, what I'm just saying is, we've got kids that showing up besides just for recognition. We're also having
It's been
kids.
part of our, like, if we have some scores and stuff, it's part of the presentation. That's only one thing. We don't do it too often, but when we do it, if it's a large group, like when, TJR brought their kids, that was not just recognition, that was part of the presentation.
how about we just simply include, because there's already language here that says that items can be taken out of order, but we can make it specific that the board president shall have the discretion to move any item with students, with NISD students to the top of an agenda.
but at the same time, you don't want to put it so late because the parents need to take their kids home. And,
No, I said
parents
move it
need to
up
be
the
home
top
also.
of the agenda. What do you think?
plus, if the kids are here, they at least get some education, see what goes on. I mean, what's wrong with that?
That's the prerogative of the board. I'm not sure.
Well, I feel like, Coach, I think the kids need to see the realities of how adults respond to things and how adults deal with it, and it's a good learning process. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think that if we stay professional when we do that, it's gonna be a beneficial thing for the kids to learn. I mean, we learn about that in civics, about meetings and things, so I think it's an opportunity for students to be able to do that. You know, I mean, we have to be responsible for our own behavior.
And I agree that the board president, superintendent should be able to bring those kids up and go ahead and let them present and not keep them at extended period of time.
Well, no, I agree with that. I don't think, that, you know, that they need to be at the end of it, but I also think we have to balance it out somewhere.
Sure.
You know, it's gotta be balanced somewhere where it's an opportunity for everyone.
You done, Kelly?
I'm not sure. Or do we want to leave this, just leave it as it is, or do you want to add the provision about where you want to put public comments and any student-related presentation, whether it's a recognition or whether it's a showcase or something else? Do you want to make reference in your board operating procedures to giving preference to students?
I suggest you find some language to leave it flexible, to be decided on the circumstances. If somebody's trying to abuse it, then it would be our duty to handle that at that time.
Okay. Anything else? I got that, all right. I also had on public comment, where on E, where we talked about the anonymous letters, page 9, is that right? Page 9E, anonymous letters or communications will not be entertained during public comment, nor will complaints or criticisms about individual employees or officers. And then the next sentence takes you into what the president will do, which is direct the individual to the appropriate complaint policy. And so while we don't traditionally have complaints against board members as officers, you do have your GF local policy, which allows any community member to complain whether or not they have a child in school and they're complaining about their child's education, or whether it's an employee complaining about their job circumstances under DGBA. So we typically always get your employee grievances and your parent grievances, but that's not to say you couldn't also get a board member complaint. So any objection to including officers there?
Officers or board of trustee members? Which,
You're the only officers of the district, like public officers.
well, I think of officers as president, vice president,
gotcha,
treasurer.
okay. Okay, gotcha, all right.
Only the
No.
officers.
Yeah,
only the officers.
are exempted.
Y'all bash
Okay.
everybody else. Okay, gotcha, yes. I'm using officers in the same way that the Open Meetings Act uses officers, sorry. Okay, so that was that comment, and then I talked about that one. I did make the change on the superintendent evaluation process to say that we would be using Lone Star Governance template beginning July 2018. Is that consistent with our discussion? Okay. I think that's all I had noted.
Did anybody else have questions on the board?
And then, of course, based on whatever happens tonight with the constraints, I may need to tweak those again there at the front.
I was assuming that would be corrected based on,
And the date was August the 17th, the blank that was in both of those. So on pages 4 and 5, I may need to edit that. So I think that's all I had.
All right. Is there a motion?
Oh, we're going, this is on the agenda for Thursday also.
Thursday, okay.
So let me make these changes, and then you guys can adopt it
Please.
formally on
Thank you.
on Thursday. Yeah.
And you'll send us an updated
Yes.
revised version.
Yes, I will.
Thank you.
Well, along with the social media guidelines.
thank you.
The board will now call agenda items 3A and 3B pertaining to the Lone Star governance. During this portion of the meeting, the board will work with Mr. Craybill to review our current restraints and develop constraint progress measures for both the board and the superintendent. Once it appears that we have come to a consensus on these items, but before taking action, we will provide an opportunity for community input. We will allocate 30 minutes for this active feedback. Any member of the audience who wishes to speak will be invited to come forward to the podium, address the board, and again, there should be no speaking from the audience at that time. Okay, with these instructions in mind, we will begin our review of the superintendent and board constraints, and we'll call on Ms. Dowdy.
Remember earlier they've got him live now, I believe, right? You ready to go live?
AJ,
Yes, sir.
we got you in both places. Can you hear us?
Perfectly.
It's echoing.
Yeah, echoing, we need to cut one of them off.
Yeah.
Mike,
I'm not gonna turn this off till I know what
Yeah.
that picture.
Yeah.
Don't wiggle it. Don't jiggle it too much.
There's AJ.
AJ!
Hello? Can you see our happy faces?
Very happy.
Okay.
All right, so we can
Okay.
hang this up here.
AJ, do you have in front of you the board constraints? I think that, that in the fall, that we currently have board constraints for superintendent and board constraints for board.
Yes, ma'am, I have it in front of me.
Okay, and so, during one of your times, I think that you were here, we worked on these, and, we did, vote on these during a board meeting following that. Since that time, and that was, months ago, we had struggled to come up with the actual, progress monitor, the measures for these. And then we understood that in the process.
Yes, the constraints themselves are value statements that the board adopts. The superintendent shall not, or the superintendent will not allow, things of that nature. The progress measures for that, the way that you track progress relative to those statements from the board, do in fact need to be smart. There has to be a way of actually measuring that the superintendent is adhering to what it is that the board has constrained it from doing.
And I think at first, we were thinking we had to go back because the board, the actual constraints themselves had been smart, so we are not, we're okay there.
Well,
But the question,
yeah.
the question has come up whether we wanted to revise these, whatever, that's up to the board. So, these are the ones we have currently, and so whether we want to redo these at this time or not. So
Well, and that would be my question to the board, is particularly in light of a lot of the community input we've received recently, do we want to revisit these and establish constraints related to topics such as staff turnover? You know, there's been a lot, I'm gonna use that one because that's the one that's just on the top of my list, in my head. You know, I think we've been trying to, I think I'm going to use the word fumbled. We kind of fumbled through this process to try to get something down on paper. My question to you guys tonight is, you know, do we feel good about these, or do we need to revisit these and put a little bit more elbow grease in them in coming up with constraints that reflect the values of the community? How do y'all feel?
Well, I mean, I think we need to visit it and.
I think we need to get the community's input and go from there.
I feel, I'm willing to look at it. There's a couple of them that I think are pretty imperative. Number one, when we look at our, we look at what our root causes are. And when we started looking at all our root causes for where we were academically, they all came back to our reading.
All right, well, based on that, wouldn't you argue then that number one is being addressed through the goals that we've established? Because through those goals, you'll have to address this in order to meet our goals.
I'll have to think about that. Let me think on that one just for, because we have had, over the past number of years, we've had a lot of different reading programs. we have had the gamut.
Which I believe it's the superintendent's call to decide, or I say superintendent, to me, that's getting into the nitty-gritty of the type of, curriculum that's gonna be used, and I'm not going to say by any stretch of the imagination that I'm an educator who needs to be making that decision. What I can say is I can reflect the feelings of my community, as a board member.
Well, but that, if you look at that constraint, we came up and said that it would be a phonics-based program.
Ms. Dowdy said it would be a
And
phonics-based
we-
program,
right.
and we backed that.
And we backed it.
Mm-hmm.
And as a board member, I can truthfully back that it would be a phonics-based program. Now,
I'm not arguing with that. I'm saying, are we already addressing that constraint through, she's addressing that through implementation of the goals, in my opinion.
well, we have to look beyond just Ms. Dowdy. We have to look beyond, at some point in time, we need to, I just feel like that, I just feel like that's a pretty important one that, as a board, but that's just.
I understand.
Go ahead, sir.
Go ahead. And I think it's important that we list these specifically as they are done, but I think also at the same time, it's appropriate to, once we hear from our community, that we go back and also take a look at, they may have some suggestions for us, but I think these are appropriate to continue to maintain.
As I recall, we responded to TEA as such. The problem statement number 1 was the school does not have a system and organized professional development and communication support for teachers. The root cause one was overall low students' performance is due to a pattern of ineffective and inconsistent classroom instruction without a comprehensive campus support system for new teachers, leaders, and students. And same thing. Problem number 2 was the students' behavior are having negative impact on both academic and social development and ultimately students' performance. The root cause 2, overall students' performance is due to a pattern of ineffective, inconsistent classroom instruction without a comprehensive, in other words, it's repeated. So maybe we have to do something, look into that.
Well, from what you just said, that pretty well looks at number 2 on our constraints. Because number 2 talks about professional learning communities and site-based decision-making team. And so from what you just described as a root cause, seems like our number 2 constraint is pretty much fits into the pattern of if that's a non-negotiable, then that's where it needs to be. Because that's where your professional learning and communities and where those, what you just read, that's exactly what those are addressed.
Can I say something about the goals, just a second, in addressing literacy and reading? If you look in your manual on page 4, you can see it's in all of it. If you read the goals, and to me, we're talking about the language of the accountability system that we're under right now. And it's not specific to reading. There's not one of these that's addressing specifically literacy. I mean, you read them, and you don't.
But I would say what you've taught, or at least what you've taught me as a board member, is that if we don't fix reading, we're not fixing anything.
That is true.
And the first thing that we have to do is fix our reading.
Right.
And by doing that, our scores will automatically come up.
They're gonna actually reimprove. But what I'm just saying is that if you look at this, it doesn't, and I'm fine, but I'm just saying it doesn't there's nothing specific here about the specific root of literacy, I mean, as a measure. That's the only thing I'm saying is, if I look at this, I don't see that, it's just talking about reading.
It's not. These goals talk
Yeah.
about all grades, all subjects,
Yeah.
or, more generically, and so that's
I mean,
the
yes,
point.
reading's part of it, but
Yes.
I'm just saying, we're not measuring here just a literacy, if that's one of our main goals, I would rather know if there's one just on literacy itself, or maybe to point that out if we're really gonna measure that specific issue.
I feel the constraints we have are sufficient. We worked on them, and I think they address the needs of our district, and they are student outcome focused. When you look at them, it's, it's all about the students, student outcome. So I think I'm good with them the way they are. Anybody else?
Anyone have any specific other ones they want to suggest?
Well, if you look at on the handbook that we have, there is a lot of examples, so we can look at those examples and see what we can do. I know when I got on the board, some of these already was established, so I came totally unaware. I got better good education when I went to, I guess it was Houston, Mr. Craigville was there, and also I learned a lot when I went to TASB. So, but I feel like we may have to add a few more items to it or some restraint.
Do you have any suggestions?
At this time, probably not, to be honest, but I think there is plenty of examples that we can add to it. But personally, I have a question, for example, the board constraint, it says, number 3, it says adult convenience or preference to take priority, that should not take priority over academic progress of the students. I need a clarification on this. I mean, somebody has to explain to me the endpoint. For example, if I call Miss Dowdy and say, Miss Dowdy, so-and-so interested in the job at Nacogdoches High School or Nacogdoches, and I'm a board member, does it come across Miss Dowdy, well, he's a board member, I probably need to consider it?
Can I give an example?
Mhm.
Okay, and I'm not saying this is happening, everyone, I'm just saying I'm gonna give you an example, concrete example that we've dealt with in the district before I even got here, okay? One of the issues is, how do we deal with bilingual students, okay, in this district? And so TEA just visited a week ago and visited our district and said, you are still not addressing ELL students in this district. And are we not doing that because of adult preference and convenience for other items, such as when they visit, they see us more interested in, and I'm just gonna be blunt, they said, you're looking at a program that addresses more of students in English learning Spanish instead of taking care of your ELL students to learn, support their first language and then learn English to pass the test. So are we doing that because it's convenient? This is what I see it as. Do we have to come together and make tough decisions to say, is this we're making this decision because it's convenience to us, because we don't want to deal with it because it's going to be a tough subject, or various other reasons? Is it because of personal feelings toward it? That's the preference that I'm talking about. Are we doing some decisions making concerning students' education and affecting who we're serving and how we're serving the students because of our own adult preference and our adult convenience, because we don't want to have to deal with that situation?
I'm not sure I understand what you're saying there, because, I'm down for the bilingual program because of the fact that it allows not only Spanish-speaking students, but non-Spanish-speaking students to learn another language, which my research that I did showed that those students do better in their testing. Okay, so I am for that program because it's showing that it's benefiting the students, and so
Right,
I'm
and
very
I'm not
strong.
saying I'm not, I'm just saying what they're seeing is that there's, and I don't wanna get into that particular topic, I'm just saying, when you have a tough subject like that,
Mhm.
that's what I'm talking about in this. When we have to come together as a team and make a decision on a tough subject because it's gonna hit the community, it's gonna hit hit personal feelings, it's gonna hit all this. Do we make the decisions correct for students' achievement based on really what is best for kids? And I'm just giving that as an example. Or do we make it according to what's our personal adult preference on ease or convenience or whatever? That's what that's talking to. AJ, that's what I'm,
May I say
Sure.
something? Ms. Dodd, ultimately, some decision has to be made by you. And with justification, with explanation, community, we're afraid of people talk. Well, if they understand what's the motive, what we're trying to do, and what direction we're going, and they are well informed, I'm sure we wouldn't have that problem. There are some decisions need to be made beyond my paycheck, I guess it's your paycheck.
and some of the topics are very heated, and some are easy to make. But you're always gonna step on somebody's toes. I don't know of a topic that doesn't. But however, when we make the decision as teams, as a team of 8 here, we've got to make it, it's saying to me that are we gonna allow our adult convenience to override the best decision for students in some of these topics? And I'm just using that as one. I'm not saying anything else about it. I'm just saying that that's one of those hot topics.
I can tell you a specific example from the past. I can remember going to the 5th and 6th grade campus as the principal, and there was a multi-age program called Odyssey. And they could join that program by choice. They had to sign up for it. The first thing I noticed when I got over there as principal was that minority kids didn't understand the process of signing up. And when I walked in there, I had a school within a school. I was really having a private school within a public school. And that wasn't even fair. And so I finally had to just say, oh, okay, if this program's so good, they're gonna get random selected like everybody else. And I was crucified for a year.
And that's some of the.
But I tell you, it had to be done because it was not a fair system. And if I'd have gone with exactly the pressure that was put on me from every level, I would have continued the program as it was. But it was not a fair system for all kids. It was a private school within a public school. So I can, this has happened in the past, and I can tell
It's
you.
happening now.
It's happened, and I'm gonna tell you, it's happened multiple times. If you start looking at different programs in the school system, when kids start having to sign up, who understands that process? Kids coming from at-risk families do not understand that process and do not know how it works, and you've already put them at a disadvantage.
And to add that, the parents from at-risk students environment certainly don't understand the signing up. And so those kids miss, it's not a fair, consistent program.
You have the same issue with AP classes.
It's,
Minority kids, you have to recruit them.
right, and you've got
They're-
to lay in a system in the district that you start early on where you start
Yes.
helping those students prepare so that we do have a diverse population
Yes.
by the time secondary. But doing so is a hot topic in a lot of communities. And it steps on toes, it steps on teachers' toes as well. Because you've got to have people willing to teach all students.
Yes.
So those are some of the things I find when we talk about adult convenience or preference, we take priority over the academic progress of our students.
Will you read
Are we
this
gonna do it
to the community?
for our convenience and not make the right decision for students? That's the whole gist.
Okay. Okay, are there any recommendations as to our constraints?
It sounds to me like the consensus of the majority of the board is that we're comfortable proceeding with what we have. Is that true?
That's the consensus? All right, if that's it, then we will now open the floor to the community for input, and I'll ask Ms. Fitch to read the constraints to our audience. And if you would like to address the board on one or more of the constraint, please raise your hand, and I will call for you at this time to come to the podium, introduce yourself, speak clearly into the microphone. To optimize participation, no one person may talk for longer than 3 minutes. Mr. Martin will be our timekeeper, and Ms. Fitch will now read our constraints.
Okay, and the superintendent constraints only, or both? Just superintendent?
Both.
Both.
No, it's
Do one at a time. Do the superintendents, okay?
All right.
And AJ, this will be your part.
All right, so we've got board constraints for the superintendent. While in pursuit of the board's student outcome goals, the superintendent shall not allow. Number 1, a literacy curriculum devoid of a research-based phonics program for grades pre-kindergarten through 3rd grade. Number 2, any campus to not fully implement and maintain professional learning communities and site-based decision-making teams. Number 3, adult convenience or preference to take priority over the academic progress of our students.
Questions, community? Yes, please.
Do you want me to approach the podium?
Yes. Can you see the podium, AJ?
Hi, AJ. Can you see me over
I
here?
need to turn it just a little bit.
No, I can't see you at the podium.
Hold on a second. We could probably push this.
There you go.
That good for you?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Rev.
Good evening, President Irvin, board members, Superintendent Dowdy, and Mr. Craybill. I'm glad to have you here today. I'm sorry, I'm just now finding out we only have 3 minutes to speak about this because this is my 4th meeting that I've come to contribute, and it's the first time I've been invited to the floor. So I have a lot of information I'd really like you to consider, and I'd also like you to consider extending the time limit beyond 30 minutes. When Mr. Craybill was here and on the phone at the last meeting, he said that a meeting like this, and one of the advantages of a community, is that we have the opportunity to build and develop these superintendent constraints. We don't get to evaluate the superintendent, but we need to be here and be part of developing the constraints, and limiting our time to 3 minutes at the podium removes us from the process, giving us no opportunity to prepare for these constraints that you set on our time tonight, President Irvin, gives us no opportunity to develop a conversation with the board as a community. As a member of the community who's worked very hard on these constraints that I'm about to present, and I have SMART constraint progress measures that I expect the board to also assign to Ms. Dowdy when evaluating her contract, I really hope you'd consider extending the time limit. So I want to start with the existing, actually I want to start with my constraints before you cut me off. Let's go back to the Lone Star's singular focus on improving student outcomes. As a board, you should preserve and uphold your elected and legislated right to exercise vital legal and fiscal responsibilities. This is your opportunity when developing a tool to evaluate our superintendent to exercise those rights. I reject the idea that following federal or state law or adhering to district policies should be used as a superintendent constraint. When you look at number 2, PLCs, that's mandated by the state of Texas. That's something we have to do. Putting it as a constraint simply tells our superintendent that you expect her to follow the law if you want her to have a job. I hope that's the minimum that you would expect from our superintendent. Her failure to follow laws and policies should be grounds for dismissal beyond this government process. I expect that as a community member, that you understand the laws and the codes of the state of Texas for which you've been elected to serve. So let's get to the constraints that I want to bring to your attention as a member of our community, constraints that I can measure with systems that already exist. First of all, the superintendent shall not allow teacher turnover to increase. We are at a critical time in this district. Looking at our teacher turnover numbers is frightening. I've got some smart measures, but I'm going to get back to that later. Second, constraint number 2, the superintendent shall not allow improvement required DRF rated campuses to have inequitable access to experienced and effective staff. It is embarrassing that we are putting 0-year principals in schools that the state is looking to take over, close, and that we have headlines in our newspapers saying just aren't going to make it. The community liaisons are telling people in our community at Rotary meetings, these schools aren't going to make it. Are you going to cut me off before I get to the third constraint?
Your 3 minutes is up, I'm sorry.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you.
Just before you come, AJ, did you want to respond?
Yeah, I'll jump in there on a couple things. I want to make sure I heard correctly. The first was the superintendent shall not allow teacher turnover to increase. Did I hear you correctly?
Correct.
The second was the superintendent shall not allow IR or D or F rated campuses to have inequitable access to experienced staff. Did I hear you correctly?
Experienced and effective staff.
Experienced and effective staff. And I know you didn't add it to the record. What was the third one so I can add that to my notes?
Thank you, AJ. It's the superintendent shall not allow district or community relations to be impeded by district communications.
District or community relations to be impeded by district communication.
Correct.
So let me just ask you a quick question about your very first one. Superintendent shall not allow teacher turnover to increase. Are you intending that there be no teacher turnover, or are you intending that there be no teacher turnover among highly effective staff?
This is a different point. We were at a 26 or so % in the last taper report, and I had some smart measures related to exit interviews, access to local professional development opportunities, that we should not request class size waivers for IR campuses or formerly IR campuses, and that we shall provide a classroom aid for 0-year teachers on IR or formerly IR campuses.
Yeah, but this question of teacher turnover.
Yes.
Are you comfortable with there being turnover if the principal identifies the teacher as being ineffective?
Absolutely.
And so that's, I'm assuming that's what you meant.
Yes.
And so your first one, instead of reading the superintendent shall not allow teacher turnover to increase, does it make sense to say something more to the effect of superintendent shall not allow teacher turnover to increase among teachers identified as effective, or should there be some quality indicator included in there?
I think that would be fantastic.
Okay, I was just asking for clarity. I think it would be a little bit scary to say we'll have no turnover, and that means that we're obligated to retain teachers who aren't working out.
Yeah, no, my number was specifically related to the taper numbers that were discussed at our last board meeting.
Gotcha. All right, that was my only question for clarity. I really appreciate you've obviously done your homework, so I just want to say thank you. I strongly appreciate you taking the time to be thoughtful about some of these ideas and put these on paper. Two things about the process, just to highlight. One, the job of selecting the constraints is owned by the board, and they are doing that through this engagement this evening. The job, and so they do that in collaboration with you and the community and with their superintendent, but the board ultimately owns that, and they're really the final arbiter of what constraints aren't selected. When we get to the progress measures, and I love that you came forward with some progress measures, because that really helps the process move forward with alacrity. The job of bringing forward and recommending progress measures actually falls to the superintendent, and the superintendent leads that process in partnership with, you know, the board and the community. So the ownership of this shifts a little bit. I just wanted to make you aware of that. What normally happens first, the board says these are the constraints that we feel reflect the vision and value of the community, and then we charge the superintendent to collect feedback from all sources. I mean, yours is a great source of feedback, but then to ultimately come back to the board and say, okay, and here are ways of measuring that I'm actually adhering to that. And then they have another conversation very similar to this one. And so I just wanted to highlight that as a process point. It's reasonable for you to expect that the board will really haggle on constraints this evening.
Absolutely.
But generally speaking, the progress measure would be a subsequent meeting, that's all.
Thank you.
Can we ask a question?
Yeah.
Public comment?
Pasty?
Can I ask you a question, JJ?
Yeah.
When you were, turning Kansas City schools around, what it Kansas City? What was the turnover rate like there?
It was, you know, it was fairly significant. I certainly would hold up the results that we got for our students in terms of increasing literacy and numeracy and going from being an unaccredited district for 30 years to, for the first time, earning full accreditation as things that are worth lauding. But we were very, very far behind. And so we took actions that were consistent with being as far behind as we were. Ultimately, we wound up laying off about a third of our staff and doing contract buyouts for, I think, about 200 teachers. And so we had, in those first 2 years, we had a very, very, very high rate of turnover, partially because we closed campuses and so we were a smaller district, and partially because folks who were really bought into the direction we were going wanted to stay, and folks who weren't wanted to leave, and so we created an avenue for them to do so. I think that level of change, turnover, I don't know that you all are in the same place we were. You know, certainly, you have a number of your schools are significantly higher performing than where we were at the time. I do think it is reasonable to expect when you're trying to make significant changes at dramatically underperforming campuses, which is a phenomenon that you all have, that at those campuses it is reasonable to expect that a certain amount of turnover in leadership, as well as in building leadership, as well as in classroom leadership, is likely to occur, and you need to be prepared for that.
Don't count that as the 30 minutes for public.
Yeah, I would like to also, it's time to clarify, is it factual that,
Just stop the clock.
that the professional learning communities is a state law on
I'm not
campuses?
familiar with that, but that doesn't,
All right, I'd like to research that.
Site-based decision-making
Site-based
is,
for sure.
is in the state statutes, but,
Yeah, I was assuming that she was referring to the site-based decision-making, which absolutely is in the Texas Education Code.
you'll see
but
some more of
not
a
everybody does
campus-based,
it. State law, but not
intervention
everybody does
to
it.
increase
Correct.
planning
Correctly.
for kids, the collaborative planning.
You know, there is an expectation, within code and certainly within rules that there be ongoing professional development in teachers, but it doesn't have to take explicitly the form, that particular form. Those expectations could be accomplished in other ways as well. That being said, I would would struggle to point to affected districts that aren't doing some type of teacher collaborative work around their instructional practice. I don't know how you grow instruction without having something similar to PLC.
If I was in Austin, I could go eat at Landis. Thank you. I'm sorry.
It's my turn.
Yes, ma'am.
Good evening, President Irving, board members, Superintendent Dowdy, Mr. Craybill. I'm pretty stunned that some of you think the constraints are sufficient. As many times as so many of us have been here. Oh, I should introduce myself. Mr. Craybill, I'm a former administrator at NISD. I'm a grandparent of 3 children in this school district, 1 at primary, 1 at junior high, and 1 at high school, and a taxpayer forever. Thank you. And as much as a very dedicated group of us have been here and said things and begged the board to listen, I'm shocked that you think the constraints are sufficient, because they don't address the things that we've been crying out for you to look at: campus culture, employee turnover, inadequate resources, both financial and employee-wise, community input and communication, and financial transparency. None of those things are addressed. The only things addressed by the current constraints that you think are sufficient are literacy, which I spent the last 2 hours before. I was late because I'm doing reading intervention at the Boys and Girls Club with 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th graders who all read on a 1st grade level. I get it. 23 years in high school. I get it. That is a root of our problem, is that we have used flavor of the day reading programs and never stuck to one long enough for it to stick. So I applaud this district's commitment to phonics. And I'm in there, and I'm working with those kids. And that should be number 1. But number 2 and number 3 don't really say anything, and certainly don't address the things that we've been coming here for months and months begging you to listen. And Mr. Green, you talked about Odyssey of the Mind and a school within a school, and how hard it is for minority kids to sign up and be involved in those higher education, higher learning things. And we had a phenomenal program that did just that we got rid of, and that was early college high school. So, we're begging you to listen to us, and we're begging you to make this district better. But when you have 3 constraints, 1 that's super important and the other 2 that really don't say much at all, that says again to us that you're not listening. So please, please, we're smart people. We're university people. We're long-term educators. Listen to us. We actually know some stuff about education. And if you'd talk to us instead of just cutting us off, we can help you, and we want to help you. But so let us help you. They're our children and our grandchildren. We want to help you. It shouldn't be a fight over what's best for our kids, because we all want what's best for our kids. Thank you.
Hold on a minute. Wait a minute. I don't know. AJ, did you have a rebuttal?
Question.
I don't have a rebuttal, but I do have clarified. I heard you say the 4 areas that you feel the board should be focused its constraints around are campus culture, employee turnover, adequate supplies, and financial transparency. Did I hear you correctly?
And community input and communication.
Community input and communication.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, I missed that.
Anyone else?
Hi, my name is Heather Olson-Beal. I'm an education professor at SFA. I'm a community member. I'm a taxpayer, and I have 2 kids that are currently at Nacogdoches High School and 1 graduate. I want to echo what some others have said and just say that I absolutely 100% cannot believe, and I'll use a few of my seconds on saying that my husband has long called me the queen of incredulity. I forever cannot believe, so that continues here. I cannot believe that we're having a conversation about how those 3 constraints reflect community values. As far as I'm aware, not one single thing has been done to even try to get the pulse of the community. On the contrary, from my perspective, many, many things have been done by many people that are sitting right here to push away the community, to silence us, to make us be quiet. So that's actually what people are saying when saying these reflect the values of the community. I feel like we're actually looking at the antithesis of that, the absolute antithesis of that. Also, I don't know what the values of the community means. There are multiple communities. There's people who are super worried about their GT kids and are super worried about dual credit, and there's kids who are worried about their kids that are in adaptive behavior. There's kids there's parents whose kids don't have access to good dental work. I mean, there's multiple communities, and I think if we can agree on anything, it should be that has not been assessed, and that this bar is so incredibly low that I'm actually insulted that has been said. It's a very low bar. I know a fair bit about assessment and about evaluation because I have a PhD in curriculum instruction. I've also looked at a number of school districts' superintendent constraints that are significantly more than what we're seeing here. So I have compared to what other districts in Texas are doing. Some of the primary rules when we look at assessment are that assessment should be specific. These are not. Assessment should be observable. These are not. And assessment should be measurable. These are not. We can't even assess or observe those things that we're now saying these are the things that we're going to look at. Lastly, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not attempting to write this language, and trying to do this in 30 minutes is absurd. It's very ineffective, and again, it's pushing community feedback out. So I don't have language for it. I think that there desperately needs to be something that has to do with community interaction, feedback, and communication. That is clearly, by all measures, a huge problem right now in this community, in our many communities. Community feedback, interaction, and communication. 2, teacher morale. My heavens, something needs to be done about teacher morale. And that, I've been here since 2008, and that's been a problem. And it's my understanding that it was a problem before 2008. So let's fix it. If we know it's a problem, and I'm guessing if we were to try to do, and I've actually done a survey of teachers, it is a problem. And anyone who says it isn't is dreaming of unicorns and rainbows. Teacher turnover is related to that, obviously. People are not necessarily leaving the profession. They're taking on commutes and taking jobs an hour and a half away to go to better work environments. That is a huge problem, and that trickles down to every area of education. And lastly, campus climate measures, which is related to that. When we know that people are very, very, very unhappy, that trickles down to kids and parents, and it has trickled, and it will continue to, we're beyond trickle. We're at sort of like avalanche.
Thank you. Don't leave, though, in case.
Okay.
You wanna ask
I'll
your
not leave. I'm here.
Thank you so much.
Doctor, thank you for your input. First, just checking to make sure I'm listening well. Item number 1, community interaction, feedback, and communication. Item number 2, teacher morale and turnover.
Yes, sir.
And then item number 2, campus climate.
Number 3.
Yeah, the only other thing I wanted to mention is you indicated that, feedback, evaluation really needs to be specific, observable, and
Right.
measurable. You are 10% correct on this. Whoa.
Did I just turn witchy? That happens. Okay. I see you now.
Have to be smart, though. The stripes don't have to be smart.
We see you now.
The commissioner expects us all to make sure we're doing our best for kids.
Thank you.
You were saying that really evaluation, if you were thinking about teacher evaluation, you'd expect it to be specific, observable, measurable. Were those the 3 words you used?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, 110% correct. The way this is set up is that first the board identifies statements that are reflective of the vision and values of the community, and really describe what the superintendent is not allowed to do, or what the superintendent may not allow. And then after the board has reached consensus on that, then you come back behind that and you add this, the progress measures. And those are exactly what you described. Those need to be specific, measurable, attainable results, focused, time bound, standard, smart, framework.
Sure.
And so that aspect of your comments is spot on. That is the next step in this process.
Right, my concern is, sorry.
The job is really to figure out, of all of the different communities, of all of the different perspectives, if you're going to narrow that down, and you're listening as a board, to just a few specific priorities, what would those be? Because as you know, the board that prioritizes everything actually prioritizes what?
Sure.
Nothing.
Nothing at all. And so really the task of the board is to really identify what are the most important of all. And so there are going to be 10, 20 different things that are legitimately important. And it's not a question of whether they're important. It's a question of what can you get done.
Sure.
And if you try to take on 20 different things, then nothing gets done and kids suffer. It sounds good for adults because it sounds like, oh, we're doing all these 20 things, but it's window dressing. It's not actually honoring the needs of children. It just honors, the looking good of adults. And so inside of this activity, what the board does is it takes all of those and says, okay, what are the top, in this case, 3, that we have to get these right first. And then in 3 to 5 years, we're going to come back and review this. And the ones that we made progress on, maybe we'll phase those out, and then we'll move on to the next ones, whichever ones are next most important at that point in time. And so the concept here is that they'll identify a very finite set of constraints for now. Generally speaking, they'll try to adopt those for about a 3 to 5 year period, because as you know as well as a lot of the educators in the audience, adopting things for 1 year at a time doesn't actually give you time to do something. And so they'll adopt them for 3 to 5 years, they'll work on them, and then they'll go back, they'll review it 3 to 5 years from now, and then say, okay, what's the next slice of this that is the absolute most critical thing? Does that make sense?
Are you speaking to me or the board?
Yeah.
Okay, I wasn't sure. I do, okay, I understand that. I'm still concerned that if we stick to these, that when it comes time to writing the specific observable, measurable things, which I believe are called constraint progress measures, we're not going to be able to, because those are, and I don't believe that those, quote, reflect community values. And I'm a qualitative researcher, so I know after sitting here for hours that there are patterns that are emerging. And so I totally get not being able to pick 20 things, but when you hear over and over and over and over community, feedback, communication, that to me seems like for sure it would be one of the top 3 things. I mean, we're at the breaking point. So I'm identifying patterns. I don't think I'm alone in saying we've got and campus climate, some big issues that need to be contended with. So thank you for your time.
Absolutely, and thank you for yours.
Good evening. As I look at these constraints, I kept waiting for the next page. My name is Elaine Lambright. I'm a taxpayer. These, number 1 is so specific that to be gauged successful, all you have to do is say, we're using this curriculum. There's no address of how successful it is, how thoroughly it's implemented, how much you're training people to use it. You would succeed at that merely by saying, we're using these books. That's not a goal. Number 2, again, how do we know whether these are observed, evaluated, whether there's good supervision of them, whether they are effective, whether people feel that they can participate in them? All you have to do is say they exist, and you've met it. Number 3 is so vague that it's meaningless. I think that the other speakers have had excellent ideas. If we're worried about literacy. It seems to me if we want a fairly broad statement here, we want to have a unified approach to literacy through all the grades. Not just say, hey, we did it through third, good luck. This to me seems like one of those measurements along the way, not your constraint. I also wonder whether all constraints must be negative. My understanding, and I might be mistaken about this, is that these are basically criteria for success in the job. So do we have to say you can't do this? Or can we say you must implement measures to improve community involvement by considering ways to raise attendance and input? And then there are a lot of ways to do that. And I've been at meetings where people had wonderful, specific, easy, cheap suggestions. When you look at it from the point of view of why don't more people participate, what's keeping them from participating, and how can we ease those things? There's nothing here about an environment in which teachers feel valued and feel safe in sharing their concerns. What I'm hearing is a lot of language about ineffective teaching. I've been in the teaching game for 30 years. Yes, there are a few bad teachers, but most teachers are wearing themselves to the bone trying to be effective in the classroom. I think we need to find out what things are holding them back and expect our superintendent and our board to act in ways to enable them to want to succeed, instead of acting as though, oh, those teachers, they don't want to teach.
Thank you so much. Just a second.
Okay, thank you.
Just a second.
The one very specific recommendation I heard from you was perhaps having something that speaks to an environment where teachers feel valued and safe. Did I catch that correctly?
Yes.
The only other just commentary I'll make is one of the great things about my job is I get to travel around the state and really see teaching in a wide variety of contexts. And one thing that you said that I just strongly agree with is I don't, even in the campuses across the state where we're not yet getting the results for our students that we intend, I have yet to come across a building full of lazy teachers who aren't trying. I do run across teachers who, sometimes just aren't doing the most effective thing, and I'm sure you've seen that as well. But what I haven't seen are buildings where folks are just kind of sitting at their desk, kind of counting the minutes pass. What I see is people working hard, and I want to co-sign on that. I think a lot of people get it twisted. Teaching is hard. There is science to teaching as well as art. Not anybody can teach. I don't care what anyone tells you. Not anybody can do this job. And so in the conversation about how do we increase the effectiveness of instruction, I just want to lift up what you said, because I don't want us to ever miss that we have to value the hard work of those who are in the profession, because they are working hard. There probably are some, all of us can improve. There's always room for improvement, and so you're not saying that that's not the case. But what I do hear you saying is that you want the hard work to be honored. I couldn't agree more. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good evening. My name is Mary Hawkins, and I am a taxpayer. I work at SFA in the Education Department. I've been sitting through these meetings for several months now, and I think that I want to reiterate what many people have mentioned, that clear communication with the public is key, and some of you have indicated that that's important. I think that there does need to be a constraint about that for either the board and or the superintendent as far as clearly communicating and get community feedback. I also wanted to say that I looked up on the TEA website some of the progress measures, and I did not find any of the examples that talked about a constraint, but they had progress measures for things like annual staff retention rates of proficiency 1 and higher teachers will increase during a certain time. Annual percentage of distinguished teachers recruited will increase over time. The percentage of proficiency 1 and higher rated teachers leaving the school system due to dissatisfaction with school system policies or working conditions will decrease from a certain percentage to a certain percentage. But there were no constraints there to link to this. They were mostly student oriented. So I think that it would strengthen these constraints to put something like that on there, even though there wasn't an example on the TEA website, because I was trying to see the language that's used. And I know that we're not doing progress measures today, but I also wanted to find out, was I correct in hearing that the superintendent will do the progress measures once you figure out the constraints?
I'll wait for your comments and then I'll answer.
Okay, so I want to know the answer to that question, because that makes a difference to me, particularly as we look at campus climate. I think it might be a recommendation to have somebody outside of the superintendent do perhaps a campus climate survey, and then we could have some knowledge, because we keep getting different stories. Oh, some people are pleased, some people are not pleased, and I'll tell you the majority of what I keep hearing is that people are not pleased. And if they're afraid and don't feel like they can really comment because of retribution, then any survey given to them in their workplace is not going, by the entity that they're afraid of, is not going to show a true value and change. And it sounds to me like this is a huge concern. We're losing good teachers. We're not losing teachers who aren't effective. We're losing teachers that are effective at much higher rate than other places in the state, which is of concern. And while I appreciate when you have a transition that many times, you know, people may not agree with the new leadership that's coming in, but this was a massive exodus of teachers here that is of concern. And Nacogdoches is a fabulous place to be. The cost of living is great. You know, there are lots of advantages here. And for new teachers, especially when we're cranking them out like crazy from the university, we shouldn't have teacher shortages here, and everybody should be highly qualified, because we are a great program there. And so that being said, there's obviously a disconnect somewhere. And so I think that needs to be addressed. Okay, can you tell me about the superintendent making the measures?
Yeah, first, I just want to start by saying thank you to you as well. I always want to acknowledge when folks have done a considerable amount of homework and reading. You know, here at the agency, we spend a lot of time putting stuff on the website.
Yes.
So, very when people read it. First, I want to check in listening. What I heard you lift up as a recommendation something around campus climate, was that the one?
Campus climate and teacher retention, I think, is key.
Campus climate and teacher retention, got it. So to your question about the process, the way this is intended is that the board really owns the process by which they arrive at the constraints. So they identify, here are things that don't want to be happening. For folks who haven't been along the previous parts of the journey, prior to this, what the board did is identify a set of student outcome goals. Like, where is it that we want to get our students? And those are the goals that they adopted previously. And you've heard the board members referencing those goals.
Absolutely.
What they're doing now is adding the other piece of the equation, which is on our way to those goals, what are the behaviors that we don't want to see out of our superintendent? And so there are two pieces of the puzzle. Where are we going for our students? And along the journey, what should not occur? What should the superintendent not allow to occur? And so developing those student outcome goals and the constraints, the process for developing those purely belongs to the board. But certainly they do that in partnership with you and the community and with their superintendent. Once the board has adopted its goals and constraints, then they say to the superintendent, okay, you need to lead the process by which we arrive at our goal progress measures and our constraint progress measures. And so the superintendent owns the process. Ultimately, it is just like this, it's a collaborative process. It's not something the superintendent does in isolation. It's a collaborative process, but the superintendent really drives it, largely because the superintendent knows what type of data is available in the district to the extent that the board generally doesn't know because they're not educated experts. So that's one part of your question. Let me also jump to the second part of your question that was implied, because you make a point that I think is very important and that doesn't come up often, which was about what are the eligible sources or data for the progress measures when we get to that part of the process. Often, people think that the only eligible source for data for progress measures is internal data. But that's actually not the case. It is entirely appropriate to use external data for those progress measures. And you already see that some folks will pull data off of the Texas Accountability report, the paper, and that's an external source. That's actually coming from us, the state. That's not coming from the district. Another common source that you could pull individual snippets from is like if you had an external audit, which obviously there's an external financial audit, but you can do other type of external audits, and that can be another source of data for the progress measure. And so this idea that if the board said we're going to use your example, campus climate, if the board said we're going to have a constraint around campus climate, and then they would, adopt the language for that, they approve that, and then they'd say, okay, superintendent, now, go back and come up with some ideas, and then let's have another conversation like this around the table. And one of the sources, an external entity, maybe the service centers, some external organization could be tapped to conduct a climate survey, or it could be done internally, or it could be done by a community partner. But yes, the point that you put up that I want to validate for the boards listening, superintendent, is that the right progress measures and low progress measures don't only have to come from data internal to the district. We strongly encourage you to look for data that's external to the district as well, as collected from external sources, because that just adds to the reliability of data sources when you have a mix of internal and external. Again, I would really appreciate you highlighting that, entirely appropriate and something that certainly I expect the board will do.
May I make one more comment? So I just want to clarify that I'm understanding you. So we're putting together the constraints for the superintendent by which she will be judged to renew her contract, is that correct? And she is largely involved in creating the measures because she's the expert at this table in that. Is that correct?
Yeah. So the superintendent evaluated on two things.
Right.
Get our students where we said you needed to
Right.
go in the goals, and did you avoid the things that we said not to do right? Those are the two things on the superintendent evaluated. Did you get our students where we said that we needed to go, and on the process of doing that, did you avoid the things that we said not to do? And so that,
Right.
when the board puts that in writing, in the form of the student outcome goals and the constraints, those are the things that the superintendent's judging on. Now, but the problem is if you need some unique data points that are very, very, very measurable.
Absolutely.
So that you can evaluate that on. So this isn't a popularity contest. This is,
Right.
show me the data that you were getting it done for my children. Don't tell me you're getting it done. Show me that you're getting it done. Show me the data that you avoided the things that you can do. Don't tell me you're avoiding these things.
Right.
Show me you're avoiding these things. So that's where the progress measures come in. And so, yes, it is the job of the superintendent to guide that process and bring forward recommendations, progress measures. However, ultimately, the progress measures, if the board, if after the conversation that the superintendent comes back, if the board and the superintendent don't see eye to eye on the progress measures, what happens next is the board should probably go back and modify its student outcome goals constraints to be more specific and clear in their direction to the superintendent. So there might be some natural back and forth. So the board could say, our constraint is superintendent, don't serve fruit at lunch. And the superintendent can come back and say, okay, the progress measures are, something about not serving pears and not serving pineapple. But then they wind up serving apples. Well, clearly the board is like, well, wait a minute, we said no fruit, But obviously we weren't clear enough, and so then the board can come back and say, you know, superintendent may not serve apples, pears, pineapples, or oranges during lunch. And
Right.
so there is some natural back and forth, that would occur. Generally speaking, that in practice, it doesn't happen that much. What happens is the superintendent comes back with something, you all have a conversation much like this one, and people kind of find their place for a reasonable, middle. That's not unlike how a lot of professional places work. Is that the ideal scenario, like with my boss, when it comes time to identify how I'm going to be evaluated, my boss and I sit down and talk about how should I be evaluated. And we talk collaboratively about what are the measures by which I will be evaluated on whether or not I've been successful as an employee. So it is absolutely appropriate for employees to be a part of that conversation of how they'll be evaluated. But ultimately, in this process, what has to be utterly clear is that at the end of the day, the board is the employer of the superintendent, not the other way around. And so if the board doesn't like where the process is, then their job is to modify either the student outcome goals or the constraints to be more clear and more directive about what they're expecting from the superintendent. And then you go back and iterate through the progress measure process again. Is that responsive to your inquiry?
It is, and I agree with you that you should be involved in your own evaluation, but I assume that your boss has a pretty good idea of what you do and is probably an expert in your field. Wouldn't you say that was close? Would you say that was true?
And that's why it has to be, you know, a collaborative conversation, because you go right to the crux of the matter. Is that the board as a whole is not an educational expert.
Right, and that's my concern, I
So
suppose.
that's why they have to rely on community engagement and on input from their educational experts that they hire, the superintendent, in order to get to a reasonable place, because they're not going to be able to get there on their own.
Okay, that's what I want to know. Thank you.
No, I really appreciate the intelligence of the questions, because you get to points that a lot of people just come off of, so thank you for that.
Short person. Hello. My name is Alicia De La Rosa Millard. This is the first meeting I've actually been to, but I have lived in this community for almost 20 years. I work at SFA. I do not have children. However, I am a taxpayer, and I do care about children. Regarding this last constraint, who is going to decide on whether or not the superintendent is doing something out of adult convenience or preference, and what are the parameters for that? That's such a vague statement. I don't understand that. So that's just one thing. But I mostly have something I do want to say. Every summer for the past about 4 years, I've worked with junior high and high school students in a summer writing workshop, and they are well aware that they do not get the education they deserve. It reflects in some of their writing, some of the pieces that they write. I've heard and read that the focus needs to be on the students, not the teachers. A teacher's focus is always on his or her students. However, when they are not given the tools and the support that they need to teach, they cannot do their jobs. When they are told how to teach despite earning the degrees, gaining the experience, and obtaining the continued education, they are not being supported, come on now. And without teachers, students will not learn. And our students deserve an education. They are, after all, our future. They are who are going to be taking over this world for us. Do we really want them to feel like dollar signs? Do we? Do we really want them to feel like pawns? I don't think so. So they need to be, so before you start saying, oh, teachers are the ones who are making such a fuss. Yes, of course they're making a fuss, because they, like me, care about the students. Thank you.
I'm Susan Teakle. I am a parent, a taxpayer, trying to figure out which of these categories I fall into. I've looked over some of the constraints from other school districts, and I think I'm starting to kind of get a handle on this, but one of them that we do not address at all that I can see that seems very pertinent to our district is the superintendent shall not allow low-performing campuses to have inequitable access to resources. And different districts, you know, have different constraint progress measures under that. But as a district that has two right now, campuses in IR, it seems like that should be addressed in our constraints for the superintendent, and there's nothing up there about it. That's what I've got.
You said inequitable access to resources, is that correct?
Yes, yes. And there are all kinds of different interesting progress measures that different districts have, but that seems like a good constraint.
Thank you.
Okay.
I have a
Anything?
question.
Sure.
So what I wrote down is, superintendent should not allow low-performing campuses to have inequitable access to resources.
Yes.
How would you define low-performing campus?
I mean, I would definitely say our campuses that are in IR would be, and then some of the districts would also include campuses that had been in IR within the past 2 years. Just different ones that I looked at, worded it different ways. But usually it was dependent on whether or not they were in IR, how long it had been since they came out of IR, that kind of thing.
From your perspective, and may not know the answer to this, so if not, I'm not trying to get you on the mic or anything. Do you have a sense of how many campuses would fit into your definition of low-performing?
In our district right now?
That you may not.
Not really. I mean, obviously, the two that are in IR now, I think I've heard the high school was a point away last year, year before, very recently. And I'm not sure how many of our other campuses are borderline or how recently they've been borderline. I'm not sure.
So if I'm hearing you, then it sounds like you've identified three criteria, potential criteria for situations to low performing. IR, they've been IR recently in the last couple of years, or they're borderline, they're somewhere near, I think you said your example is, I heard the high school maybe been a point away, so some numerical way, they're in danger of being IR. Those are kind of the three criteria you're looking at when you're looking at performance.
Sure.
So, that was the main thing I wanted to make clear, because obviously, if the board were to adopt something like this, then they needed some clarity around which campus we're talking about, so that we can know.
Yes.
Make sure that we do provide equitable access to resources. That's why I just want to clarify. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. That will conclude our public forum. And we have already adopted these constraints, right? Yes.
We kind of talked about it before the public input. I would kind of ask the same question now that we've heard the comments. Are we comfortable with these, or do we want to consider some of the comments that were made tonight?
I think it warrants for us to sit down and look at the stuff that we've heard today and discuss it, because there's a couple of things that I wrote down that I would like to kind of absorb and think about, but I think that it warrants for us to, I'm not sure that I'm comfortable with these constraints at this time after hearing the things that I've heard. And that's just my thing.
Can I toss something out that I think might be helpful? Is, Mr. Craybill, could you talk to the board members a little bit about how they take the information that they received tonight and fit it into the goals that they've already adopted. You touched on it a little bit, but I think they heard a lot of stuff that doesn't readily translate to getting them from point A to the goals that they've adopted. And so, do you have any input or advice on that? Like, how connected does a constraint have to be to a goal, and how do those two things work? How are they supposed to work together?
Yeah, great question. So first, I want to address the easy direct question, which is how connected do the constraints in your goals have to be? And the answer is they don't have to be directly connected. It's ideal for there to be some type of supportive relationship between them, so that there's a mutual reinforcing clarity of vision from the board and the superintendent. But they don't have to be perfectly in lockstep with the other. And so I definitely encourage you to lean that direction. But sometimes there are circumstances that take you away from that. So what you wind up with is a set of goals to describe what you want to accomplish for your students in the district, and a set of constraints to describe what you don't want to see happen on your way to that goal. And you put these in place partly because these describe the vision, value of the community, the vision being the goal, the value being the right? But you also put them in place because they are your mechanism for evaluating. So some talks about what I've heard this evening. Actually, this isn't that hard. There are a lot of things that you all took notes as well. That there's a lot of overlap here with what you shared. Obviously, there are things around campus climate, there are things around community engagement, feedback, there are things around, and then there are things around equitable access to resources or experience and effective staff for lower performing campuses. Those are kind of the big three themes that I heard. And then certainly there are a bunch of other ideas that were added in as well. Ideas around financial transparency, adequate use of supplies. Actually, I think that's everything. Everything fit into those big three things. Those big three things, those two ideas. And so there are a few ways that the board can go about this. The board has clearly already adopted three constraints. And so what I would recommend you do is your next step in the process, I would hold on to those three constraints and then set that aside for just a moment. The next thing I would do, if I was you all, is I would think through, what have we heard this evening? Are there any things this evening that we think rise to the level of being the make or break issues regarding what needs to happen to improve student outcomes in the district? Here's what's important to remember, and this is the tough part. I know in the audience, this is the really tough part. Every single thing I heard tonight, to me, sounds important. I didn't hear a single recommendation from a single person that sounded out of line or inappropriate. They all sounded important. But as a board, your work here is difficult because you're not actually here to figure out if they're important or not. You're here to figure out which are the few set of them that we've got to work on first. And that if we don't nail these first, that everything else is going to fall apart before we even get a chance to work on it. That's the hard part. So you're not actually figuring out which ones are important, which ones aren't important. These are all very reasonable issues for the board's consideration. Your job is to figure out if we hear some this evening that we think are more urgent in terms of what we need to hold our superintendent accountable for than any of the ones that you already have. And if so, then I would come back at future, probably at your next meeting. I wouldn't advise you to let this thing linger for a long time. But then I'd come back and have a conversation about, okay, here, say one more that is really vital to you. And you have to go back and decide, are we going to add that and try to have four? Which I don't recommend. It will dilute your efforts. You can do it, but I just don't recommend it. Or would you say, there's this other one, and it's more important than this one, so we're going to have this in these are the three, or but that's really the next step of your process, is to think through what are, like I said, I heard 3 key themes that were repeated by multiple speakers. And I think your work was figuring out which, if any of those, rises to the level that it is more urgent. It's not that any of them are less important, but some are more urgent than others. And it would be worth bumping down. That's one way of going about it. Here's the other way of going about it. You could try to modify your existing 3 in ways that would allow you to capture some of these things that you heard tonight in ones that you already have. So as an example of that, you have one that talks about any campus, the superintendent should not allow any campus to not fully implement and maintain professional learning communities and site-based decision-making. I think it's really a scenario where you could say, we're going to modify this to be more specific to addressing inequities in PLCs, staffing, and site-based decision-making at our low-performing schools. And in that scenario, now you kind of married some of what you've heard tonight with some of what you already have. And then you could take some of the progress measure ideas that you've heard tonight and then put them up under that. And so I think those are kind of the 2 big options you have. You can try to look and see if there's something that is important enough to replace an existing one and have a new set, or are there ways to blend them together so that you capture the ideas that you heard come forward. No matter which path you choose, here's one thing that I strongly implore you to do. If you do nothing else, do this one thing. Make sure that you honor the feedback and the wisdom of your audience and the time that they spend coming out to inform you this evening by making sure you in some way communicate back to them how you have used what you heard from them and how you use the information that you've heard. And so, for example, if based on what you heard, identify 5 new progress measures that you embed and 1 new constraint that you embed, be prepared to come back and say, we heard these 20 things. Of those, we chose this one to add in, and these 5 progress measures to embed in other ones to make sure that it's reflective of what you all described. I think one key thing that will discourage folks from participating in work like this is that they don't get a clear message from you on what did you hear and how did you use what you heard. And so whichever path you go, I would strongly counsel you, make sure that you take that added step at the end of this process. That, when you are voting, you're doing so having communicated that information back to your constituents. So let me stop there and just kind of check what other questions I have.
Can I ask just one follow-up, Mr. Craybill?
Sure.
Is when you said, looking at everything you've heard tonight and as one option, let's focus on the top 3. What are the 3 that are most urgent? What I wanted to follow up with, are you asking them to pick or suggesting they pick the top 3 that are most urgent to the accomplishment of the goals that they have set? In other words, that's my question again, is how directly tied are the constraints supposed to be to the goals? Because that's what I understood they did the first time. The first time when they crafted the constraints, it was because it specifically says that she shall, in reaching those student outcome goals, she's not to do X, Y, and Z. So the intent was to tie them to how best do we get from point A to point Z. But if that's not what they're supposed to be doing and they can kind of step back and look a little more globally, I want to make sure I'm on the same page.
Yeah, and so I want to repeat this. And the ideal scenario is certainly that there is some relationship between your student outcome goals, here's what we want to accomplish for our students, and your constraints. Here's what we don't want you to do on your way to them. That is certainly the ideal scenario. But again, I want to reiterate, that is not a requirement.
Okay.
So the encouragement you're hearing me offer around urgency in terms of accomplish your goals. I'm offering that, as a recommendation, because I think that's the ideal scenario. But I want to reiterate that is not a requirement of constraints. If they are completely disconnected, that's entirely appropriate. Your constraints don't have to be a vehicle directly linked to your goal. That is an ideal scenario that they be so, but it is not a requirement. So the needs of your unique situation need to take priority. If the needs of your unique situation allow it, you've heard me say, I continue to recommend that you look for what are the set of constraints that these values most urgently need to be addressed in order to really set you up for success with your goal. That's what I'm recommending to you, but that is not a requirement, that's just a recommendation.
Thank you.
Reverend Irvin, I know you can't see me back here. Can I ask a question?
Sure.
If you'd like copies of what I worked on, I brought copies for the board. And I'd also like to note that what I developed in concert with the existing goal progress measures and goals that the district set.
And I really appreciated the homework you did. Somebody just had to email me. I just for my own education, I'd love to read the work.
I'll send you an email.
I have a comment. Something that you said, and when I was reading through this, and these, we have some copies of some progress measures that were kind of written up as potential progress measures, some suggestions that have been given to us. And I will just, after going through this and some of the things that are said tonight, for example, communications. I've heard that a lot tonight. I've heard that a lot at different times. I'm gonna go back to number 2. If a site-based decision-making team is working as they should, the process goes that you bring a program, potential program, a principal wants to bring a potential program to the school. What they'll do is they send 3 or 4 teachers out, they go look at the program, they get it, figure out they like it, don't like it, then they come back to the site-based team. They kind of sell the program to the team. The team kind of gets on board and everything works in harmony. And that process usually takes a year and a half, 2 years to work through. And then you train them, and then you train within your campus, and everybody's on the same page. When you do it in that process, the communication barriers are broken down because everybody's got buy-in. Well, we kind of that's, to me, the community, if number 2 is working like it's supposed to, the communication barriers are broken down between teachers, administrators, and central office, because programs are brought in a very systematic manner, in a very way that it should be brought in.
You left the community out of that, though.
No, well, each site-based team's got to have, each site-based team on each campus has got to have community.
You didn't say it, though.
Well, with
You need to-
community, they have to have community input, and they have to have a business person on that site-based team. That's the way the statute reads. Those things have to be in place. Now, I can tell you, we kind of gave a directive this year that process didn't have time to mature, because we did not have the luxury of that taking place in a 2 to 3 year period. We had the luxury of 1 year. Yes, a lot of communications completely broke down because we were under the gun. I'm not saying it was the right thing to do. I look back now and we gave a directive that was pretty hard and fast. So, yeah, but I think in number 2, if we write our progress measures correctly, we can include all the people in the community about communications breaking down. The stuff brought in by Ms. Peck about our campuses not having, and some of those not having the most recent, or the most talented folks available in their campuses can be addressed with 3. If you look at 3 and look at progress measures, it can be brought into 3. Because honestly, if you're going to bring your most experienced principal or your most experienced teacher, they're not going to be raising their hand and saying, I want to go.
Especially the competent.
So you're going to have to be, when you do that, you're going to have to, sometimes you're going to have to do some recruiting, and you're going to have to do a lot of things to get that to that point. So I'm just saying, I think, just looking at it, there's a lot of things that were brought in today, and I'm looking at a lot of these progress measures that, I don't know who wrote these. Did you write these, or?
Are we talking about just examples?
These examples?
Yeah, Kelly and I have worked on this because.
Well, I'm just saying, these examples that were given, a lot of the things that they talked about tonight were addressed in some of these progress measures that were given to us as potential. They're not ironclad, they're just a starting point. I'm just saying that I'm not saying let's keep all those. I'm just saying that this kind of broaden our thinking of what are some progress measures that could address some of these issues within the confines of what we got.
Can I ask a related question? I don't know if I'm asking that to you, Mr. Craybill, or the board.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I'm curious if there are community members that are on the site-based decision-making teams, how those people are selected and how that information would be communicated to parents, because I've had 3 kids in a Nacogdoches ISD school for 10 years. 99.9% sure that I've never seen one single communication about being on a site-based decision-making team, anyone who was on them, an email, and I get emails, I get reminds, I get texts, I got Facebook, I got information out the wazoo, and I've not seen in 10 years anything about any person being on any site-based decision-making team. So I'm not sure how that's happening, but I'd like to know.
How site-based decision-making teams are derived and organized and all that is a local issue.
Mr. President, I'll make some comments.
Sure.
Mr. Craig, as I became a board member, I had to go to a Lone Star Governance Convention in Fort Worth last summer. And I had a wonderful teacher, Ms. Kay Douglas, and gave us some instruction. She described school system is made of teachers, student, administration, school board, and involved citizens. And she also said, and to promote district's vision and goals, the board shall accomplish this by advocacy for students, families, staff, and stakeholders. At the same time, the community should understand that the responsibility of district superintendent is to manage the district and its operation and work with the board and the community to meet district's goals and visions. And as a person who's been a member of this community for a long time and been in a public school for 35 years, somehow, I'm sure I received the same number of emails or phone calls that other board members receive. I have to come to a conclusion, and that's personally, has not related to any of those constraints or arrangements. I said, I personally believe the success of NISD without a stability, qualified teacher, and trust and involvement of the community is like climbing a tree to catch a fish. And I don't mean to be funny, I don't mean to be sarcastic. It's just an observation that I have. I talk to myself a lot, but sometimes it's good to talk to other people as well.
I think we're in agreement.
Thank you. Anybody else? Thank you, AJ.
What, I'm off the clock already?
Yes, sir.
Well, wait, Reverend, you've only done the superintendent constraints. You need to go do the board constraints as well.
Oh, the board?
Yeah.
Board constraint, we hadn't done
Oh,
board constraint.
well, you're not off the clock. We have to go to the board constraints now.
So before we move to board constraints, where are we at what's the plan for the superintendent constraints?
No action.
No action.
Let's think about it and come back and,
We can't do action tonight.
yeah, we can't, we need to,
So,
work on them.
so our plan is table it and come back and discuss it another time.
Well, what I would ask is that we'll have another workshop, prior to our board meeting next month. And maybe,
So essentially what's happening is the intention was that the board was going to come together this evening and really reach consensus around a set of constraint progress measures. However, it sounds like as a result of listening to community feedback, that rather than move forward in the process with constraint progress measures, the board wants to be a little bit, time to be thoughtful and reflect on the feedback that we received from the community. Consider whether or not that will require changes to your constraints. And then, once you've done that, then you can come back to the original purpose of tonight, which is to try to move forward on a set of constraint progress. So it sounds like, from my listening, the board has heard that there's some unreadiness on the part of the community, and you want to take some time to be responsive to that before continuing the process. I'll tell you, as an outside observer, I think that's a very reasonable approach to slow down, take a moment, and consider the feedback from your community. The one thing that I would add, that I recommend is that somebody, whether it be the board president or you can, pass the buck to somebody else, take some responsibility for coming back to the board with some type of summary of what was heard tonight, or some type of potential wording, whether it's rewording of the constraints to try to be inclusive of what you heard, or working with the constraints. I would not recommend you come back to the next board meeting with nothing. I recommend that somebody come back with something. And whether the board tries to do, whether a board member does that, whether you want the staff to do that, whether you want your legal counsel to do that, whoever it is that you're going to assign, I just recommend that you assign to someone the job of doing something with this, so that when you come back to your next meeting, you're responding to something that you're not just starting off from nothing.
I'm a little reluctant to start up, just keeping pushing that ball down the court. I'm kind of more in terms of having the superintendent and her staff start looking at some progress measures under these constraints to see if there's some constraints. There's some progress measures under these restraints. These constraints could address the issues that are looking at tonight, so that we can start, and then we may just throw out a constraint. We may add a constraint, but just to go back and to start all over again.
Well,
I don't think
that's what he's saying.
I don't think anybody's saying that. I think he's saying we've got these three, and we've got these sitting over here. Now we've got to take what we heard tonight and decide if there's anything on that that's more important than what we've got on the three. Do we want to replace any of the three, or do we want to add one? Adding one is not his suggestion, but it is an option.
But I guess what I'm saying is, for me to say if this is, the ones I want to stick with or not may have some bearing on I may have some bearing on my decision based on what those progress measures look like. If the progress measures coming out of it address the issues that we're talking about, a lot of the issues we're talking about tonight, it may have some bearing as to whether I want to keep that or not.
Well, let's give it some thought.
Am I making sense?
Let me make a suggestion. It sounds like some of these can be tweaked to take into account, and/or progress measures can be utilized to take into account. And much like the board operating procedures, which have had a process that they've developed under, why couldn't we, as individual board members, just like we did there, provide our feedback to the board president or the administration with ideas concerning these three categories and/or goal progress measures by a certain deadline, timeframe, and then they can look for the commonality to put it together. To give us a little bit more of a central focus, so
Right.
that when we do come back together, we've honed it down a little bit to make education type decisions.
I feel like we need to be a little further down than just looking at them. I want some specific, start looking at some more specific things to look and to see, can we address these issues?
I think that can be taken into account, exactly what you're saying.
Yeah.
So,
All right, we'll move now to the board constraints for the board. Go ahead.
Let me find my sheet. I'm running out of gas. Board constraints. The board will not allow the board to allow, number one, allow adult convenience or preference to take priority over the academic progress of our students. 2, collectively or any trustee individually to perform or appear to perform any of the roles delegated to the superintendent. 3, collectively or any trustee individually to violate board policy AE local. Callie, what is AE local?
I had to look it up too. I was like, what is it? It's your educational philosophy, which basically says your core purpose is instruction,
Okay.
not athletics, that kind of thing. It's very short though.
Not AstroTurf.
No, you said that, not me.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, but it is very
I'll
short.
be in trouble for that.
It's your educational philosophy is to educate kiddos.
So are we doing public comment on this?
Yeah, better.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, we will now open the floor to the community for your input to talk about the board constraints for the board.
I know you're so surprised that I worked on this too, guys. I've been to a lot of meetings. I've done a lot of work. First of all, I really, I want to thank you for opening the floor to public comment. I think it's very essential, and I think it's really difficult for us as a community to contribute to the discussion of local board policy when you just made changes to a board operating procedure that has not been shared with the public. Sure. Do they make them around? Reverend Irvin Heck. Sorry.
We share.
All right, I'll make copies. I'll send them to you all. It's really difficult because, first of all, we just talked about a board operating procedure that none of us have seen. I specifically asked for copies of it, and I know that one of the board members requested that the superintendent provide that to me, and it was never provided. So when we're talking about board constraints, I think being aware of the board operating procedures is really essential for us as a community. Further, the board operating procedures that you did just identify and what you spoke about in public meeting tonight included evaluating the superintendent on superintendent constraints that have not been developed in concert with the community. So if we're going to change those constraints, I'd really ask the board to share those board operating procedures with the community prior to voting on them at the meeting Thursday, which I think is on the agenda, especially since they concern and they contain superintendent constraints that have not taken into consideration the community as a whole. I feel like the board shall operate within the board's role as defined by local policy. Should we know what that is and be part of developing that? You should definitely uphold your elected and legislative right to exercise vital legal and fiscal responsibilities on behalf of the district. Please don't do what the board trainer who came for Lone Star Governance said and say, in your board constraints, follow the law, because that was really frustrating for all of us sitting in the room to hear that as a board, you were considering mandating following the law that we'd hope you'd uphold as elected officials. So I want to look at the constraints that you gave to yourself. Allow adult convenience or preference to take priority over the academic progress of our students. We specifically talked about how vague this is, and we've seen examples from this board in which special favors have been done for friends of members of this board, that we've seen adult preferences and favors take precedence over the priority of academic progress for a lot of students. And I just throw that out. If you're not going to follow your own policies, don't legislate them, please. I'd recommend that you not modify your board policy more than once a year so we as a community could come to understand that policy. Don't modify the goals that you set forth in the Lone Star government process more than once a year. And please don't try to be the superintendent, as you noted in your second point. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Oh, yeah. Me too.
Me Too is a different kind of movement.
You did ask us to come,
I just have two suggestions after attending numerous meetings over, especially the last 4 or 5 years, that possibly you consider making a board constraint the quality and the quantity of your communication with the community. We've talked about that with the superintendent. I feel like it's been, over the years, quite poor. There have been a lot of messages, both implicit and explicit, about the degree to which community feedback is desired, meaning that it is not. And then another thing that I would suggest is that possibly you consider something about actual attendance at meetings. In 2015, I was part of the facilities steering committee. I, for sure, as just, a schmo in the community, attended more of those meetings than numerous board members. At that time, I went back and traced attendance at board meetings over about a 2-year period and discovered that, and some of the people who I'm talking about are still on the board, 1/3 of the board members missed 1/3 of the board meetings. So there were many times when I, like I said, as just a schmo / parent, taxpayer, professor, community member, knew more about what was happening than the board members. That's very problematic for me. I understand about things coming up, but literally 1/3 of the board members did not attend 1/3 of the meetings. That, in my mind, as a taxpayer and who's someone who wants to participate in representative democracy, is well lower than what I would expect. It's my understanding that a number of years ago there was some sort of policy that board members were expected to come to a certain number of meetings. I don't know what that was, and that was, over the last several years, gotten rid of. I would like to see that brought back. I understand that it is a burden for the school board members, but I also feel like it's something that you guys signed on to. So just a suggestion. Mary Hawkins, who's awesome, says there's a progress measure for that on the TEA website.
It's part of the board self-evaluation.
Okay, well, I don't know if it's happening. I'm just saying that I know that, and I've looked up attendance records, like I said, for some people who are here and some people who are no longer on the board, and they were pretty bad. And I feel like all of you guys need to know more about what's happening on the board than I do. And that is sometimes in the past has not happened, so.
I heard a board constraint on the board about the quality and quantity of board communication, and a board constraint on the board about attendance at board meetings. Did I hear you correctly?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
I'd put communication with the community, AJ.
Yes.
Yeah, quality and quantity of board communication with the community.
Hi again. I'm Mary Hawkins, a taxpayer. I just wanted to say, somebody pointed out something very important to me just a moment ago, to say that we appreciate your service. Change is hard, and when you're improving, it's hard. to realize that it wasn't already done, or maybe you didn't look at things correctly. So I just want to give kudos to you. It's hard to sit up there and hear all of these things and think, oh, maybe I didn't think about that, or I hadn't thought about it from that point of view. So thank you for that. The other thing is, there was something on the TEA website about how many meetings members had to achieve, and it was under those progress measures. So that may be something that we can link to here if there's not a specific constraint for that. And I do think that if you want to encourage goodwill with the community, which you seem to be open to, then that would go a long way if you put that in some form of constraint there and actually put it down on paper and said, yes, this is a big issue for us, and we want to embrace the community and have you be part of that. And so that is my feedback for that part of the board constraint.
Next. All right, that concludes our public forum. Thank you so much. Any feedback from you, AJ?
Well, the only overlapping things that I heard in those comments really was speaking specifically to the quality and quantity of board communication. I think that's always fair. I think it's always important, versus elected officials constantly getting better at that. I like just the amount of homework that folks have done. If I was there, I'd be passing out little gold stickers, for what was done. Really grateful, for the talk.
Thank you.
Thank you. You off the clock, AJ?
Yes.
All right.
Just so that you know, this is how we roll the TEA. It's often a team effort. I'm not the only person sitting at the office at this hour. We've also got the Director of Governance and Investigation. Constable is also here. But we are, any way that we can kind of lift up your success. I want to say this, and I don't want to sound harsh, but I do want to be clear. Like, you all are in a place of struggle right now. You know that, I know that, obviously your community knows that, otherwise it wouldn't. And in a moment of struggle, I've seen this nationwide, that there are really only two paths that school systems go. That in moments of struggle, the true grit and the compassion and the commitment of a community is revealed, and people come together, and smaller, pettier stuff, things that frustrate you, that aren't central to the mission, fall away, and things that could absolutely undermine what you're trying to accomplish become the thing that you all rally around and focus on. That's one way that I see community respond to the type of adversity to which you were facing. I pray that is what Nacogdoches chooses. And I say Nacogdoches, and not just Nacogdoches ISD, because this is all of y'all. We're on the precipice, frankly, of the state having to consider additional interaction, with the district. I don't want that for you. The ideal scenario is for y'all to figure out how to come together and get this done. But let me just tell you again, what I have seen from working with school boards in school districts around the country. Either you will come together, you all will figure out how to make the main thing the main thing. You will figure out, you will make the choice that there is something that I want to win on, and I will choose to set this aside. I will choose to not win on this issue because it's not the main thing right now, knowing that I can pick it back up next year after we get through this current crisis. Like, either that will be your behavior, or you all will stumble, and those repercussions will impact the entire community in ways that I don't want for y'all, and I don't want for your children either. And so anything I can do, anything that we as the agency can do to help kind of bring a wholeness, collectivism, and action, anything that you want to call on us for, that we can support you in this, don't hesitate to do so. We will be here all night long, every night, if that's what it takes. We know that the answers for the children of your community already exist in your community. You have blessings that a lot of communities don't have. You have opportunities that a lot of communities don't have. And so this is something that you all can do. But if you don't, it's because you all chose to be divided rather than be united in this critical moment. So I just want to reiterate that so that you hear it from an external source. This is your opportunity to come together around the most critical things. There are things that frustrate you. You will need to set those aside for the short term so that you can hear for yourself the things that are most important long term. And this is the test. I mean, this is the test. I'm excited to see you all pass it. Thank you for having us call us anytime.
Thank you. You have a good night. Make the motion, Steve.
So moved.
Make the motion.
I make a motion that do we have a clear what we're gonna,
We'll get it. We're Hialeah, Texas.
okay.
Yes.
I make a motion that we adjourn.
Second the motion. We need a second.
Second.
Huh?